Hey guys, what's up? Today I'll be ranking the entire main Tales series from easiest to hardest. Now the Tales games are known for being pretty challenging, every single one of them. Doesn't mean that the easiest are actually very easy games in my opinion. Just keep that in mind. And also, I'll only be covering the games that are playable in English. That means no Tales of Destiny 2, the real one, or Tales of Rebirth. All the others, including some Japan exclusive games, are here. And also, no spin-offs like Tales of the World or the mobile games. With all that clarified, let's begin! Alright, we're gonna start with the easiest, which is Tales of the Tempest. This one only came out in Japan for the Nintendo DS. It was received poorly for being too short with bad AI, and, well, for being too easy. Thankfully there's a fan translation that's been out for a long time. I really like this game despite its flaws, and I've always thought people are just too harsh on it, as usual, without even having played it. But anyway, yes, it's easy, still challenging in some areas, but most of the bosses are honestly a walk in the park. Developers didn't really put a lot of effort to the difficulty, and you can clearly see that. Still a pretty good game, but yeah, definitely the easiest of them all. Next up is Tales of Hearts R on the Vita. Hearts came out on the DS too, but only in Japan. Fortunately, we got its amazing remake on the PS Vita, and that's the version I'm ranking today. True, like any other Tales game except Tempest, some bosses can be pretty brutal, but I only remember a couple of them giving me trouble. Most of them, and also most regular enemies as well, felt balanced, if not somewhat easy. I love the battle system in this game because it's so fast-paced and responsive. Because button commands are both a combination of skills and attacks, it's pretty easy to abuse combat. Performing a combo at the right time will trigger an aerial combo or a finishing move or a chase cross attack with an ally, which makes the battle system automatically easy in my opinion. Next on the list, Tales of Symphonia. Symphonia is the most popular Tales game out there. It's also the one that popularized the series in the West. It's pretty balanced. I remember from playing the original GameCube version. It was the first one to include 3D combat and the beginning of the linear motion battle system in multi-line. It's a little bit clunky, but the hit detection works decently, however, that's why it can be somewhat challenging at times. I do recall a few boss battles being a pain in the ass, especially some of the spirits, but other than that, it's a very balanced and friendly RPG, which is why maybe a lot of people love it so much. Next is Tales of the Abyss. This one has better combat and controls than Symphonia. You can clearly see an evolution in the right direction. Problem is, they evolved the enemy AI too, which means the challenge increased slightly. Abyss, however, is still for the most part a very welcoming action RPG that can even serve as a great entry for beginners into the series. Why? Because just like Symphonia, there's not much to say about its difficulty. Controls, collision detection, the overall combat is easy to understand and therefore easy to manipulate. Not exactly an easy game per se, but definitely one of the easiest in the series compared to the others. Next is Tales of Xillia. This masterpiece has the best battle system in the entire series in my opinion. I thought it was perfection because it remained true to the classic motion linear combat but also mixed some really responsive fast-paced hack and slash and beat 'em up elements. It has two protagonists, and I'll admit playing the Jude route was harder than Mila's, though it's kinda weird that most enemies are a walk in the park even on normal. Bosses are a different story. They have boosted status, so taking their HP down is what can make Xillia harder than all of the previous titles in this list. But its combat is also so damn easy to abuse, what with all the combos, the chain attacks, and the linked arts. It's called the Dual Raid, and you can beat the crap out of some bosses if you put it to good use. Next up is Tales of Vesperia, the original. If not Symphonia, then this is the most popular Tales game ever made. Now, Vesperia has a combat called Evolve Flex Range LMBS. It consists of giving the player free movement around the battlefield. It also catches on with different strikes, which are the regular attacks or the cancel attacks. You can interrupt enemy attacks with them and keep abusing your combos. An overlimit bar is there, and if you successfully execute fatal strikes, it fills up quicker. Once activated, you can just beat the crap out of everyone for a while. So you see, it's very easy to exploit. But I'd like to point out that this strikes feature is also used by your enemies, so if they get you, they get you. And that means Vesperia can also be somewhat unforgiving sometimes, but it's not really that hard. Coming right up, Tales of Berseria. This one also has a pretty exploitable battle system, much more than the others, because it's based on creating combos in a quick-based combat called Liberation LMBS. LMBS stands for Linear Motion Battle System. Nevertheless, the difficulty also backfired in this game because of the soul gauge. It's like an action points bar in turn-based RPGs. You can only attack for so long until you run out of it, and will have to either guard or run around for a while until it recharges. Attacking with depleted soul gauge points will make your attacks almost useless. Now, picture all I've said so far during some of the boss fights, and you'll see why this game can be pretty challenging most of the time on normal mode. Still, I love this battle system. Not one of the hardest, but definitely not one of the easiest either. Next is Tales of Eternia. Eternia is the third game in the series, mistakenly known at first as Tales of Destiny 2. The combat here is completely in 2D, there's no variation of the linear motion battle system, but it's faster, better, and more responsive than its predecessors, especially the PSP version, which is the one I play the most. There's not much to say about it, except that going back and forth mid-battle can sometimes put you at a nasty disadvantage. Eternia's biggest problem is that some enemies, especially bosses, are a pain to take down, so the button mashing makes your thumb hurt real quickly. It doesn't have clunky controls, but controlling some melee characters can get tiresome rather fast. Those are pretty much the only reasons why I found it harder than all the previous titles in this list so far. Coming up, Tales of Symphonia 2. The sequel everybody hates and I love. It's hard, way harder than Symphonia 1. The reason why is because the combat is different. It's a combination of several variations of the LMBS system from Destiny, Abyss, and even Innocence. I gotta say, it's better than the first Symphonia, more responsive, faster, less clunky, and more immersive. Problem is, your characters seem to be way weaker than most enemies, and since they can strike you like in Vesperia, you can be defeated in just a few hits. Another reason is because each character has an elemental attribute, so if the enemy is abusing that attribute against you, imagine how painful some bosses can be. Sure, there are Unison attacks and the Mystic Artes are back, but that doesn't make the game any easier because bosses can do the same. Symphonia 2 is the perfect example of how everything you do can be used against you during battle, and that's why the spike between Symphonia 1 and 2 is so big. Next is Tales of Phantasia. I'll be covering the PS1 fan translated version, only one I've ever finished. Phantasia is a grindfest, and it's tough for merely technical reasons, like pretty much every single Tri-Ace game in existence. That's right, some of the key developers of this game quit after its release and formed Tri-Ace with a spiritual successor called Star Ocean. While still a very memorable game, I have to admit the combat wasn't the best because it's slow and tedious sometimes. Your characters are responsive, thankfully, but the hit detection can be either sluggish or missable at times. Still, you can manage to create some good combos and nasty area of effect attacks with your magic characters. Guarding is easier too as the enemies are slow to attack, but dodging is very difficult and sometimes can only be achieved if you keep running back and forth. Overall, it's still a great game, but it can be harder than many of the other Tales entries. Next on the list, Tales of Zestiria. This one has one of the most convoluted battle systems in the entire series, up to a point where it's really hard to master, abuse, or pretty much enjoy. Fusionic Chain is the new variant of the LMBS system. It means creating chain attacks with your character's wacky controls, ruled by two gauges, the Spirit Chain and the Blast Gauge. The higher the points on these, the better your chances of successfully dodging or even staggering the enemies. But of course, this also interferes with your combos and especially when receiving damage. Aromatization is pretty much a fusion between one of your two main characters and a seraph. This is the only way sometimes to have a real advantage on the battlefield on normal or hard mode cause you're overpowered. However, Zestiria not only has some camera and control issues but also terrain issues. The real map battle system pertains to initiating a battle without having to change screens. With some bosses you gotta do something really specific to take them down, but nothing beats the final boss where you have to abuse a certain character skill just to be able to beat it, otherwise it's practically unbeatable. Next is Tales of Destiny. Alright, so Zestiria is harder, but there's a few things that makes Destiny one of the hardest of them all. I have no quarrel with the battle mechanics, which are as wacky and repetitive as the ones in Phantasia or Eternia. Because of that, they can take too long sometimes. I don't know why I felt them to be longer than in the others. Oh, that's right, because the encounter rate is higher than in any other Tales game. Not even worth mentioning some of the bosses that can easily drain your health with just a few hits. Biggest issue is the encounter rate combined with some horribly backtracking and nerve-wrecking puzzles out there. All Tales have a few extremely unpleasant dungeons or puzzles, but Destiny took the cake for me and drove me crazy. Never finished this PS1 original version. I'll have to wait for the remaster of the PS2 Director's Cut to see if they fix these major issues. Next on the countdown, Tales of Legendia. Legendia is my favorite Tales in the series, precisely for being different. We're back at a 2D combat screen, this time with stronger beat-em-up elements. Project Melphis co-developed this game and apparently they were hardcore enough to fiddle with the limbs as in LMBS. The variant is now called X, or crossover limbs. That obviously resembles a fighting game or a beat-em-up. To me, this was the epitome of the 2D combat we saw in games like Destiny or Phantasia. It was almost perfection, except for the fact that controls are honestly not greatly responsive. Some attacks will be slightly delayed, which makes it harder to hit enemies, therefore making the collision detection dysfunctional sometimes. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very often. Enemies and especially bosses have a lot of HP, so it takes longer to take them down. And because it takes a long ass time to fill up the climax gauge, which freezes enemies and bosses alike for a period of time, it only makes the battles harder. Still, I adore this game and it was quite a pleasant challenge for how much I enjoy the battle system despite its small flaws. Alright, the last three, and number 3 is Tales of Innocence. Innocence is another Japan exclusive title released on the DS, later remade for the Vita. Neither version made it to the West. Original DS version, however, has an English fan translation, and that's how I played it. But I also never beat it for how excruciatingly repetitive it is. You can see enemies on the screen, but avoiding them is very hard, which means you'll do a shit ton of battles no matter where you go. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult. The other is because its limbs or LMBS variant, the Dimension Stride, is quite hard to grasp. Controls and hit detection are fine, but camera movements and evasion maneuvers are hard to pull. And of course, your characters are delicate fairies that can easily die with just a few hits. Because of the limitations of the Nintendo DS, it wasn't greatly implemented, often rendering the difficulty and the controls painful. Especially since it's a 3D battle system with no joystick whatsoever. The enemy AI is smart and it can be pretty nasty even on regular encounters. Another major problem is that your party was reduced to 3. Like, why? All other Tales games in existence had 4. Well, except Tempest, of course. That was fixed on the Vita remake, but we never got that version, so here's hoping for an official release of it one day, or at least another fan translation. Number 2, Tales of Xillia 2. Cross Dual Raid LMBS. It's merely a small upgrade from the battle system in Xillia. Only real and easily noticeable difference is that the main character can switch between various weapons mid-battle. Of course, they designed the enemies to be strong and weak against them, so that's the first red flag on difficulty. It spikes so hard too because of the depth you acquire at the beginning, forcing you to grind like crazy or take on some of the powerful wanted monsters. A second and final red flag is the ridiculous spikes with most bosses for having a very smart and nasty AI, mostly thanks to your characters being weaker than before and delicate as flies. No matter the ending you go for, the final battles will be painful, particularly with the bosses just having way too much HP and insane boosts in their defense status. I still love this one and it's one of my favorites in the series, but man, what's wrong with the Tales sequels? Why are they so much harder than the first games? Number 1. Tales of Graces. First released on the Wii in Japan, then enhanced on the PS3 worldwide. Style Shift LMBS is the name of its variant, and oh boy, it doesn't pull any punches whatsoever. It's by far the hardest system to understand and get into. So hard that I eventually had to downgrade the difficulty to easy, and even so I got my ass brutally beaten late in the game. Combat here is so technical, it relies on something called the chain capacity. It means you need to create several different combos and learn new ones by repeating it. Problem is, some monsters are strong against certain combos and your initial attacks can make little to no damage often, so by limiting the player to only a few blows, forcing them to recharge their gauge every time, gives the enemy a huge advantage. Your characters are just easier to stun unless you build up something called the Elif gauge, which grants you unlimited chain capacity points for a while. Achieving this, however, means you'll have to perform several successful combos. Berseria took the same ideas but in a much more balanced way. Graces pretty much ignored the classic LMBS features and went haywire. At least the hit detection and controls are great here. Now don't take me wrong, I love this combat, but it's very hard to pull through even on the easiest difficulty. Alright guys, that's my ranking. If you have a different ranking or a different opinion, put it in the comment section below. Now let us wait for Tales of Arise. Will it be very hard, very easy, one of the easiest, one of the hardest? We're just gonna have to wait and find out. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!